Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Forum. This is the 18th Sunday after Pentecost, and today our guest speaker is Reverend Canon Allisyn Thomas, and she will be speaking to us about sacred rest, a personal sabbatical. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Reverend Allisyn.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you. So let's start with an opening prayer. And this one is actually from the Book of Common Prayer. You may not have even known this particular prayer, or call it, was in there, but it may be one that you want to refer to from time to time because it is the prayer for the good use of leisure. Let us pray. O God, in the course of this busy life, give us times of refreshment and peace, and grant that we may so use our leisure to rebuild our bodies and renew our minds, that our spirits may be open to the goodness of your creation, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So today we're going to be briefly talking about the issue of sacred rest, personal sabbatical as a spiritual practice, and as part of it at the end, you'll be invited to take a nap. So we're going to practice. We're going to practice this. We often associate sabbaticals with certain professions, such as, say, a university professor or clergy. In the case of clergy, which obviously is a big deal around here, it is common after 5 to 7 years for a clergy person to take a sabbatical up to 3 months to rest, study, and recharge, re-engage spiritually. But I think a lot of times we just, with certain professions, such as, say, a university professor or clergy, it was worth hearing again. So, sabbaticals are not limited, however, to these certain professions, even though that's how we tend to associate them. All of us have to pay attention to our need for spiritual self-care. We all need some form of sacred rest, a personal sabbatical of sorts. Now, I don't know about you, but many of us tend to struggle with this. The idea of actually setting aside time for rest in a balanced way. I'm going to read a quote from Thomas Merton, the great mystic. And it's from a book which I meant to bring and I didn't. But if you ever want to look at the issue of sabbatical or Sabbath in a good way, it's called Sabbath by a man named Wayne Miller. And it's an excellent, excellent book. So this is the quote that he gives by Merton. There's a pervasive form of contemporary violence, and that is activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone and everything is to succumb to violence. The frenzy of our activism neutralizes our work for peace. It destroys our own inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful. So before I go on, what strikes you when you hear that this kind of busyness is a form of violence? I mean, that's strong language. Anything come to mind? Is it shocking? Do you agree?
Against yourself.
I'm sorry, Terry, what?
Against yourself.
It's a form of violence against yourself. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else?
Absolutely agree. When it gets overworked and overloaded doing what are decent and good things, it can just you reach a tipping point and help.
Yeah, so Roxanne was saying that when we allow ourselves to succumb to this busyness, overwork, whatever, we do get under siege. Maybe to paraphrase, and I've talked about this in a previous form, it's a form of soul killing. So it really is a form of violence. And so the question then becomes, how do we allow this to happen? Especially people who should know better. And Miller suggests in his book, it's because we have forgotten about the Sabbath. You know, we all know, on the seventh day, consecrate it, make it holy, blah, 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 blah. But many of us don't do that. And for families, especially with children, this can be impossible. But it's not just the Sabbath day. And I think this is part of what Miller's talking about also, is we tend to look at the Sabbath, sabbatical, rest, in too narrow a term, in too narrow of ways, and as a result, don't participate. It's getting, once again, into my screed against perfectionism. The whole idea of sacred rest as a spiritual practice is necessary to maintain our health of spirit. I don't know about you, but taking care of ourselves becomes something we check off on our list of to-do things, which actually makes it more perfunctory than compelling. Okay, I'm going to take a dog for a walk. I'm going to go to the grocery store. I'm going to make breakfast. I'm going to pray for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to pick up my husband from work. Whatever it may be. And when it becomes more perfunctory than compelling, we see the result of this in this slew of broken New Year's Eve resolutions and Lenten disciplines and practices. We all have the best of intentions, and pretty soon it just goes down the drain. So, as Roxanne implied, there are consequences that when we neglect this need for sacred rest. While not limited in any way to clergy, because clergy is a topic I know about, this is one of the ways that it ends up getting seen in clergy life. And once again, I'm not trying to make poor clergy, but it's just, no, not poor clergy, but that this is where we see it. In studies done across denominations, across faith traditions, clergy suffer, well, I'm going to become a barista, from obesity, hypertension, and depression at higher rates than most Americans. Addiction rates are relatively high. Use of antidepressants has risen. Life expectancy has fallen. A 2005 survey of Presbyterian clergy conducted by their Board of Pensions found that the number of clergy who left ordained ministry during the first 5 years quadrupled compared with the 1970s. In 2012, the Church Pension Fund of the Episcopal Church found that about 9% of clergy in the Episcopal Church left after their first 5 years. I was told when I was in seminary, and this was back in about 2000, that it was 1 in 10. So this is just one snapshot of what we're seeing within this particular profession, vocation. But you can see this whole idea of quiet quitting that we're reading about a fair amount in the papers, that people just can't maintain this level of busyness. So clearly there is a need for sacred rest and Sabbath, but most of us just aren't very good at it. With constant access to email, texting, we do not take a Sabbath day, let alone any kind of prolonged rest. I don't know about you, but there is an expectation, an unspoken expectation, that even on one's day off, they will still check their various devices. This is especially true for type A personalities. Identity and ego tends to get wrapped up in our work versus, say, our identity as children of God. That somehow what's right in front of us, our work, has become more important than what brings us, say, to church in the first place. We make idols of our vocations, or whatever it is we become so busy with. Many of us have boundary issues. We are too taken over by the needs of others, or we might have somewhat of a savior complex. And I keep on thinking, I have a savior. I don't need to step in. But we do so at the expense of family and friends. This was a really interesting thing for me to discover. When I was here on staff, at one point when smartphones became the norm, I started getting my work email on my phone. And I did that at my next call, which was at the bishop's office. And then from there, when I went to St. Bartholomew's, somebody told me, a very wise man said, don't put your work email on your phone. You can have it on your iPad, you can have it on your laptop, you can have it here, but for God's sakes, don't put it on your phone. So I said, okay, I'm going to try this. It was really anxiety-producing in the beginning, because I was so used to being able to be reached or to reach somebody 24/7 that all of a sudden I was afraid that somehow I would not meet these unspoken expectations of people waiting to get a hold of me 24/7. And yet, within a couple weeks, it was such a relief. Once I could allow myself to just put it down, just one device. I mean, I still had plenty of others to get it. But just cutting down on one device made a huge decision. So tell me, does any of this resonate with you about, yeah, I'm seeing, okay. Bill?
Gigantic ego boost that he's so busy and so needed.
I know, there's only one Bill Eadie. You know, that's true. It really is an ego boost to think that, oh my gosh, look, I'm at lunch and yet I've gotten 600 emails. I'm important. Claudia, I saw you nodding your head too. Yes. What about it resonates with you?
Well, it's an addiction, really, I think. The phone, the iPad, Messenger, Facebook, there's always information flowing. And especially during the pandemic,
yeah,
when you were isolated, it was a lifesaver. It felt like you were really connected to the world instead of sitting at home alone.
That's true.
Yeah. And it's hard to break that once you've established that nice 2-year-long habit.
Right. Right. Sherry?
It's something, at least for me, that started slowly. It's like I didn't really notice, if you will. And it makes me think of the analogy about the frog who is put in a pot of water that's cold, and gradually the water is heated to boiling, and the frog, of course, dies. And I think, frankly, that happens to my soul also. It's like gradually my out here gets to be more important than my in here.
Yeah. Terry?
Excuse me, sorry. I've read that, like when you check Facebook or something, if there's something there for you, it's like triggers the same thing as cocaine.
Dopamine rush.
No, it doesn't.
That explains, I'm sure it does. It probably releases some sort of chemical. Yeah. Andrew?
I was at a nursing home administrator.
Wait a minute. The mic's on its way.
Yes, sir.
I was at a National Administrators Nursing Home Convention back east, and one of the participants, good friend, was a wonderful Jewish guy. And Saturday came, I watched him come down to the pool with a briefcase. He sat in a nice, comfortable chair, opened his briefcase, it was full of cash. He just simply took out some money, stuffed it in his shorts, and had a stack of newspapers. He spent the entire day doing nothing but reading newspapers. And he would send out for a sandwich now and then. He kept the Sabbath on that Saturday. All day long, the sun set, he packed up his stuff, went up to his suite, I guess, and that was that. And I was amazed and impressed by the fact that this guy kept his Sabbath all day long and then was ready to go on Sunday. It's the program. He did it.
Which I'm going to get to shortly, which speaks to really the simplicity of what this can entail. It doesn't necessarily be nice, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to the top of a mountain for a week and not talk to anybody, which is pretty hard for most of us. Connie.
I think one of the problems at St. Paul's is that we are so poorly staffed. If Brooks didn't answer his email, if Brooks didn't work on his day off, I'm not sure what would happen here. And I'm really serious. This is not a joke. He is supposed to be off on Friday. Well, Friday he's taking somebody to the hospital. Friday there are services. Friday there's preparation for a major service the next day. And he never gets a day off. Never.
I'd like to say I had an answer for that. I mean, it was somewhat similar even when I was on staff here. But yeah, in the case of someone else, we do have to start thinking about how we take care of each other too, and how we can hold each other accountable in the midst when there is so much to do. We all worry about our Brooks. So to that end, we all know we can do better. But to what end? We often use our vocation and our busyness and our workaholism to justify our existence, which we've been talking about, while at the same time beating ourselves up for succumbing to it. Tara Brach, who's a psychotherapist and Zen practitioner, talks about the two arrows. And this is an example of how this might work. The first arrow is, I didn't pray. Boom. Second arrow, I'm a really bad Christian. Boom. So we don't do something and then we make a judgment, a negative judgment about what we haven't done. I know I've certainly done that when I intended to do something and then didn't. We really have perfected the skill instead of rest of beating ourselves up. But that, once again, this speaks to where do we hold and abide with our identity. So one way to get away from this two arrows syndrome, and does that sound familiar to people? Just anybody ever done that before? Good, I thought I was the only one. Is to adopt what's called, and this is another Buddhist term, a spirit of Maitri, or Maitri, M-A-I-T-R-I, which is meaning unconditional compassion, compassion for self and others. That to really rest into this place of Maitri allows us in many ways to reacquaint ourselves with our need and our desire for sacred rest, but with kindness, not judgment, not a negative judgment. So Wayne Miller also suggests that we've forgotten the Sabbath because we too narrowly defined it. Let's say it's to one day. He writes, if busyness can be a kind of violence, we do not have the time to stretch our perceptions very far to see that Sabbath time, effortless, nourishing rest, can invite a healing of this violence. When we consecrate a time to listen to the still, small voices, we remember the inner wisdom that makes work fruitful. We remember from where we are most deeply nourished and see more clearly the shape and texture of the people and things before us. In Matthew's Gospel, 11:28, Jesus says, "Come unto me, all of you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." This practice of Sabbath is a way of taking refuge, to recall that Jesus is with us always, and we can always come to him and rest. Now, I know this is going to be kind of corny. It is. But one of the things I do sometimes when I'm driving is I picture Jesus in the passenger seat. He's got a seatbelt on, don't worry. And I still haven't gotten to the point where I can put him in contemporary clothes. But it's a way for me, even though it's sort of funny, of just remembering. It's not just empty space. This is Jesus. So during Sabbath, we set aside a sanctuary in time to disconnect from the frenzy of consumption and accomplishment and consecrate our day, or not just going to say our day, our time, as an offering for healing all things. The other thing we need to remember is that Sabbath is not just for ourselves. We all need to be rested and refreshed so we're able to serve and live to the human spirit's innate generosity. Isn't that a wonderful thought? The human spirit's innate generosity. That once filled and rested, we can be more authentically useful and kind. So, what do we mean then by sacred rest? It really is about healing heart, body, mind, and soul. So in a wonderful book called Sacred Rest, Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, and Restore Your Soul by Dr. Sandra, let me get her last name, Dalton Smith. She talks about 7 forms of rest. And I think this is another thing we do sometimes, is we also too narrowly define what it means to rest. And she talks about in her medical practice how when she sees somebody is not rested in one of these 7 areas, like everything else, it tends to boomerang into these other areas.
Sorry to do this to you. Swapping links just because.
Oh, I was just resting. So the first kind of resting she talks about is physical. And that is, she defines as the chance to use the body in restorative ways to decrease muscle tension, reduce headaches, and promote higher quality sleep. I think sometimes in our competitive ways, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, that when we think about physicality, we're thinking about exercise. Exercise is good. We need to exercise our bodies, but to also rest our physical selves. It may be taking a walk. It may be sitting under a tree. It may be getting a massage. Whatever. Roxanne saying? Yeah, massage, yes, okay. Yes, I'm pro-massage myself. The second area where we need to focus our rest upon is mental, and this ability to quiet cerebral chatter and focus on things that matter. I personally have a hard time with this when I'm stressed. It's really hard for me to turn off the. Do you remember from the old Peanuts cartoons with the adults? Wah, wah, wah. At least for those of you of a certain age, but that's sort of like what my brain does, wah, wah, wah. The next one she talks about is spiritual. The capacity to experience God in all things and recline in the knowledge of the holy. You don't have to do it just on Sunday mornings. There's various ways to do that. But this is an area where we need to rest. It's not just a matter of doing church. It's a matter of being with God, however understood. The next one she talks about in which we need rest is emotional. The freedom to authentically express feelings and eliminate people-pleasing behaviors. Now, I'm not being critical here because this is something I do, but think about the times maybe you go to eat with somebody, and both of you pull out your phones and put them on the table. It's really hard to fully connect with somebody when I'm also paying attention to my phone. And there may not be an emergency, like I really need to be gotten a hold of right away. But as I think maybe Claudia, you said, it's become a form of addiction. But this emotional rest is almost impossible if we don't detangle ourselves in some manner from the things that tend to sap our feelings, or sap our emotions. The next form of rest is social, and this is the wisdom to recognize relationships that revive from the ones that exhaust, and how to limit exposure to toxic people. I think one of the terms I hear a lot is energy vampire, and it sort of speaks for itself, right? There are certain people that may not have the same effect on others, but for you, for me, for whatever reason, are not healthy to be around. And yet, because of my people-pleasing nature, I want to get them to like me or to whatever. And so I end up spending all this energy, and then I'm exhausted. And often to no accord. It just doesn't work. The next form of rest she talks about is sensory, and the opportunity to downgrade the endless onslaught of sensory input received from electronics, fragrances, and background noise. Now, perhaps because I was giving this talk today, this morning when I was home, we have a water cooler at our house that keeps water either hot or cold. So it's electronic or plugged in. And it emits just this slight sound, which I'd never noticed before, because usually we're in the kitchen talking and stuff like that. But all of a sudden I realized there is so much sensory noise that's happening that we're not even aware of anymore, right? Someone was asking me recently, when was the last time you saw stars? Can't remember, at least for those of us who live here in the city. And then the last one finally is creative. The experience of allowing beauty to inspire awe and liberate wonder. So do any of these forms of rest resonate with you, or say, I'm good at this, I'm not so good at this, I want to see about getting some more balance in my life? Gary?
Resonate. There we are. Thank you. I don't have to project. Hello? Okay. The most important people in my life have become the people who aren't in my life. I'll leave it at that.
I don't even know what that means. Yeah. Yes, praying prayers, absolutely. Okay, others. Sherry, you were nodding your head.
Two of them strike me. Most of them I'm not good at. But the one about sensory inundation is the word I would use. It's like everybody at the cathedral knows that I am really hard of hearing. One of the things about hearing loss is that an aspect of it is what's called recruitment, where things, normally people with regular hearing can be around noise and it's okay for them. For some with a hearing loss, what recruitment does is to make noise painful. So that thing about sensory rest, I went, whoa, what is that? It's like so unfamiliar that I don't know what it is, but I'm actually not sure where I'm going with this. But do you know what I mean? It's like you're like steeped in it like a tea bag, and you don't even notice, I don't notice, when it's depleting me.
Right.
It's like I have to be at empty to get it, rather than noticing that things are shifting.
Yeah, once again, your frog analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure which one this fits in, but I've been retired forever, but I have like a little bit to do, just, and to keep, I need some schedule. Anyway, I remember, I guess on a Sunday, I looked at the calendar for like Monday through Saturday, there was nothing. And I thought, this is great. And then like by Monday afternoon, I thought, this is terrible, so.
Yeah, that's funny. Richard, I see you.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the sensory part. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, so it was always quiet and wonderful that way. And now I've lived in urban areas ever since basically college. And I remember last year I went home for my dad's 80th birthday as a surprise. And I remember going out on the lake that is in front of where my parents live. And they're the only people who live on it, and my ears rang for an hour plus.
Wow.
Because of just the amount of silence beginning to reverberate in my body and not everything else. And just how long it took my body to get used to that again. And it was so peaceful, but I distinctly remember the ringing out on the lake until it died.
So once it died, did it feel good?
Felt fantastic once it was gone.
Okay. Yeah. So, like everything else on the, I'm talking about let's disconnect from the internet, but I want to tell you about an internet link. If you're curious about these 7 forms of rest that are identified in this book, you can take a quiz that Sandra has put on the internet, and let me tell you, it's one of those things like, do what I say, not what I do. Apparently I'm a mess. But if you want to take it, it's www.restquiz.com. Very easy. And you may be really interested. There are some things, and it's a good quiz because it's one of those that gets at the same thing in lots of different ways. So you think, I've already answered that, but then, it's like it just peels the onion, another layer of the onion, just a little bit. And it was really eye-opening. And so that's an easy thing to do. So Sabbath is ultimately about connection, and I think that may be part of the problem too, is that when we think about sacred rest and Sabbath, we tend to think about it as a solitary matter. This is something that I'm going to do for me, which is fine. But really we do it for each other, and we do it for our connection with God. Sabbath is, like so many things, one of the most profound communal things that we can do for health of a community. We do it for all of us. We do it for ourselves, and we do it for all of us. So more often than not, it involves quiet, but not always. Sometimes Sabbath may involve words. Sometimes it involves prolonged periods of time. Sometimes it's just moments. So here are some possible things. Obviously, prayer. And I talk about prayer a lot. One of the best definitions of prayer I ever heard, and this was from a former dean of this cathedral, John Chain, who said that prayer is tuning into the conversation God is already having with us. So we don't have to be thinking about the words. God will take care of it. But prayer may be just being present. That is a big part of prayer. That it's just tuning into the conversation God is already having with us. It may be meditation or centering prayer, which is a very specific type of prayer. It may be a work meditation, such as laundry. Sometimes the holiest thing you're going to do all day is fold the clothes, depending on the intention that you give it. I hate folding clothes. But when I have to, just to quiet the mind and do it, it's fine. It's time with God. It doesn't have to be a chore. It becomes a chore when I make it a chore. But we have the ability to look at our intention and change our intention. One of the things that we tend to lose sight of in sabbatical is that writing letters, making phone calls, and connecting with dear ones can be a true form of Sabbath. Think about and I'm not good at this, but think of the last time you just called somebody to talk to them. Not to get something set up, not to engage in some sort of transaction, just to communicate. This is how you doing? How am I doing? Hang on, we're getting the mic.
Okay.
That sometimes is awkward because when you call, people expect you to either ask for something or tell you you're going to be doing something. So when you call and you just say, hey, it's just checking in, the conversation kind of gets awkward.
You're right, absolutely, because we don't expect it. When I was younger and there weren't as many forms of communication as there are now, people actually did call more often because that's the only way we could connect with each other, especially if we weren't living near each other. But you don't do it that much. I don't do it that much, but we tend not to do it that much anymore. But when we allow ourselves that time to make that phone call and then you get over that initial awkwardness, it can be pretty amazing, you know. Robert? Hang on, let Richard give you.
Here you go, sir.
Oh, I need this. I think I need this. I think it's often a nice surprise these days because people don't expect to get phone calls anymore. They expect to get texts or whatever. And so when you just call to say, I'm checking in with you, just to see how you're doing, it's usually very nice. I do this with Alice, my friend in Brooklyn. We're not setting up our usual let's rent a place in Florence transaction. We're just there to chat. Yeah. But that said, I don't think God wants to hear what I have to say when I'm folding a fitted sheet.
Has God, well, you don't know.
Well, maybe so, but anyway, I mean, there's a limit to that business of calling people just out of the blue, and how often you do it. You have to be judgmental. I mean, you have to have some judgment about that, I think.
Well, and you weren't here when I first started, but a big part of all this is to not judge.
Oh.
Is to suspend judgment, which can be hard, but to adopt what the Buddhists would call maitri, which is unconditional compassion for self and others, and just have that be how we look at ourselves and how we look at each other. Now, I still may think somebody's a fool or be pissed off that they cut me off in traffic. This is not something I do necessarily. So then I do the two arrows, right? Ooh, I got mad at that person. Oh, I'm a terrible person. Then, so it can be crazy. Another form of sabbatical is music. It's said that when you listen to music, you're praying twice. Of course, it probably depends on the music. But reading, not for work, just for the pleasure of reading, like you were talking about, Andrew, this man reading his paper and just having a sandwich and sitting outside, and that's a lovely day. That's a lovely day. Artistic endeavors. There's one woman I know who's is a weaver. She has a loom. And she talks about how just the repetitive activity of working at the loom and seeing what comes out of it is some of her most sacred time with God. You know, she can just sort of get into the rhythm and then let it go and see what happens. Time in nature. Now, it's interesting because a lot of times if we're going to spend time in nature, we have to be busy, right? We've got to be hiking, we've got to be swimming, we've got to be doing any number of things, and those are all good things. And once again, no judgment. But for instance, several years ago, I was at a retreat at a place called Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, which is unbelievable retreat area in northern New Mexico. And there was a tree, and there was something about this tree that just drew me to it. And it turned out that somebody had carved a seat into it, and so I just nestled into the tree so I could sit. And I got this sense that I was with Mother Tree, probably the spirit of the indigenous people from that area, but just sat there until I was done. And how many times do we just sit and abide and be? It may be a minute. That's good enough. Take that minute and enjoy it. The other thing that may be helpful is to set up a consecrated space in your house. A place, like I have in one of my rooms, I've got my meditation pillow and a little altar where I put various objects that I consider sacred. And I try and have my sitting meditation there a couple times a week, and that space is just for that. And so I know when I'm going to that place. Sometimes it's wonderful, sometimes my mind is like, ugh. But there's something about having that space to always be there, and I can always look at it too, and know that it's there. And it's a place where I will, more often than not, engage the holy. But we don't often set up just a little space. It doesn't have to be big. It could be a chair. It could be a cushion. But just something like that. So I'm going to, we've got time. I want to engage in a very small form of rest. And I don't think this is what it's called. I learned it from Brene Brown in one of her books. And I call it the 4-square breathing exercise. And so just get comfortable. What you do, it's very simple. You breathe in to the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You hold it for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's try it. And I'll count so you don't have to. So inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now, come to the present. That was a form of sacred rest. That was a form of Sabbath. And it's so easy. We make it so hard. But it can be so, so easy. So the last thing I want to leave you with is, once again, and you probably can tell that my Buddhist practice has greatly informed my own spiritual practices, and this is what Buddhist nun Pema Chodron calls the 3 difficult practices. And the first one is to recognize when you're getting hooked on something, and she calls it shempa. You know, like that sort of sense, like somebody irritates you or somebody really delights you, but it's like, you know, all of a sudden you're hooked. And you would normally, let's say, yell or do something maybe inappropriate. She says first step is to recognize when you're hooked. Second step then is to do something different. To do something other than your initial impulse. It could be as easy as looking out the window, but something to stop the hook. And the third practice is to make that a way of life. So when you think about these things and you start maybe getting into the second arrow or whatever, is just to think about these 3 difficult practices. Maybe do the square breathing. But in all things, just do so with love and compassion for yourself and in thanksgiving for God. And finally, I end with a lovely quote from Gandhi. There is more to life than merely increasing its speed. Thank you, everyone. And somebody wrote this nice note for me, said, have fun. Isn't that awesome?
Thank you so much, Reverend Allisyn. That was wonderful. In next week's forum, Peter Boland and Spencer Vogel will be here to talk about paganism, then and now. Have a great Sunday, everyone.
Thank you.